Hey everybody, this is Steven from Dogwood Handcrafts, and welcome back to another cutting board video. Today I'm going to be making a brick and mortar style board out of walnut and maple wood. I'll be making 9 rows of bricks, and each row will have 6.5 bricks. So I'm going to need to make a panel with 7 pieces of walnut with 6 strips of maple in between. Then I'm going to need to make an all maple panel for the long mortar strips. So to start off, I set the table saw fence at 3 inches wide, which will give me some nice wide bricks. The walnut is about 1 3/4 inches thick and very hard, so I have to take my time cutting it on the table saw. I cut 6 pieces 3 inches wide and 1 piece 1 3/8 wide. Once all the strips are cut, I run them through the planer to bring them down to exactly 1.5 inches high. Then I cut the maple strips on the table saw to also be 1.5 inches so that they'll match the bricks. The maple strips are pretty thick, so I'm actually able to cut each piece in half on the bandsaw and get 2 mortar strips. I run the 8 maple strips through the drum sander to smooth them out and bring them down to 1/4 inch thick. Then it's time for the first glue up. I asked the pizza delivery lady to squirt glue on the wood, and then I use a paint roller to spread it all out. Then I clamp everything together. The next day I unclamp the panel and check out how it came out. I use a hand plane to remove the excess glue that's squeezed out between the wood pieces. The panel is too big for me to use in the planer, so I go ahead and cut it into strips a little over 2 inches thick. That extra material gives me some wiggle room so that later I'll end up with a final board thickness of around 2 inches. I cut 9 strips in total to make the 9 rows of bricks that we need. I have a stop block clamped onto the table saw fence along with a strip of plywood to keep the strips in place during the cut. Once I have all the strips cut out, I run them through the drum sander to make sure that they are the same thickness and will glue together nicely. Now I need to prepare the long mortar strips, shown by the arrows here. I glue together a few blocks of maple that are longer than I need in case I end up needing an extra mortar piece. The next day, I unclamp the maple panel and it's time to get the final pieces ready. I run the panel through the drum sander to get it nice and flat. Then I use the same table saw setup so that the mortar pieces will be the exact same height as the brick rows, a little over 2 inches. Each of the maple strips is about 1.5 inches thick, so I can get 4 mortar strips from each one if I use the bandsaw, since it has a very thin blade. Then I sand all the strips nice and flat and make sure they are 1/4 inch thick, like the vertical mortar pieces, so that the brick pattern will look right. With all the pieces cut, I do a test fit to check everything lines up right and looks good. But there is still a lot of work left ahead. Now it's time for the final glue up. I ordered another pizza, and luckily the same woman showed up to deliver it. She's a gluing pro now after helping with this board. The next day I unclamp the board and it's time to finish it off. I need to flatten both sides of the board since it moves around a bit when you do the glue up. I use a router sled for this, which is basically 2 rails clamped to my workbench with a platform that sits on top. The platform lets you move the router in any direction, so you can easily get the entire surface of the board down to the exact same level. I use bolts to hold the cutting board securely in place and then check that the platform moves freely. I insert a large flattening bit in the router, which can remove a large area of material quickly. Then I affix the motor to the plunge router base. I slowly work my way across the board, and my goal is to remove only as much material as I need to for all the wood pieces to be level. In this case, it's about 1/16 of an inch. Once I finish one side, I loosen the bolts and flip the board over. Then I flatten the other side the same way. You can see the board is pretty flat, but we do have some router marks to remove. I use the drum sander to sand out all of those marks and get a smooth finish. The short sides of the boards are pretty uneven, so I'm going to cut a thin slice off of each side on the table saw. I used the crosscut sled and make a very thin cut. I only needed to remove 1/8 of an inch or so to get each side flush. Now it's time to cut the juice groove into the board. I clamp the board in a jig, which gives me a perfectly spaced groove all the way around. I work my way around the outside of the board, being careful to keep the router lined up properly. For double-sided boards, I like to cut handles halfway up each side. I got a new edge fluting router bit, which cuts a perfect handle into the board. I used some masking tape to keep the wood fibers from tearing out on the end of the handle. This is how the freshly cut handles look. Now it's time to sand the whole board. I start with a palm sander on the sides to get rid of any marks from the saw or any extra glue. Then I sand inside the handles. I also sand inside the juice groove. The surfaces of the board are end grain, which can take a long time to sand. I use a 6-inch random orbital sander to get rid of any sanding lines and give it a perfectly smooth surface. I use a sanding block to blunt all the edges while keeping them fairly square-shaped. I also lightly sand the corners the same way. I use a branding iron to burn my logo into the sides of the board. Then I clean up the excess burn with the sander. Finally, I dunk the board in mineral oil. The oil makes the board look really nice, but it also keeps moisture from getting into the wood and damaging it. I let the board soak for a few hours and then pull it out to drain. Thank you so much for joining me for the making of this beautiful cutting board. You can find more information about my cutting boards and other work at dogwoodhandcrafts.com. See you next time.